638 Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Welcome on in. Along with Johnny B, Ken Weaver, Dan Mandis here. Want to welcome into the program Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation, our legal analyst on Nashville's Morning News. Hans, always great to have you on. There's a lot of legal stuff in the news today, so I'm really glad that you're here. Last night, a federal appeals court put the Texas immigration law back on hold. Now, I went to bed last night and I thought it was a big victory because the Supreme Court had said that Texas could proceed to begin to arrest people that were in our country or Texas illegally. Then I guess it's now been put on hold by a federal appeals court. So I guess my question is, I thought the Supreme Court had the final word, but obviously not.
Well, it would if the case was substantively up before the court. But all that the Supreme Court had before was, requests for emergency stays or getting rid of a stay on the statute while the case is in the appeals court. And all the Supreme Court basically said was, we're not going to do anything really at the moment while this case is before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So basically, they threw it back down to the Court of Appeals and said, look, it's up to you because you've got the case right now to decide what to do about it. And there was a decision from a panel, not the full court, but a panel 2-1 saying that while we're reviewing the case, the statute will not be enforced.
So what do you think ultimately happens? I mean, will Texas be able to begin arresting people they feel are in the country illegally at any time, or do you think this is just going to ultimately be something deemed unconstitutional?
I think Texas is going to have a tough time. I agree with and understand exactly what they're doing, but they're going to have to convince the Supreme Court to overturn a bad decision the court issued back in 2012. This was a decision in which Arizona passed a similar law that said if somebody enters the country illegally, it's not just a violation of federal law, but it's also a criminal violation of Arizona law. And back then, the court issued a 5-3 decision saying you can't do that. That interferes with federal preemption. But keep this in mind. The justice who wrote that opinion was Justice Kennedy, and he's gone. Another justice who was in that 5 majority was Justice Ginsburg. She's gone and been replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. So I'm actually hoping that when this gets back to the Supreme Court on the substance, the Supreme Court says, that earlier decision that wasn't right, and I hope they overturn it.
All right, so in other news, Hans von Spakovsky is joining us from the Heritage Foundation, our legal analyst. President Trump continues to battle Jack Smith over Trump's actions related to January 6th. This is a special counsel investigation. Donald Trump has now filed a SCOTUS brief in his bid for absolute immunity. This is how they phrase it on Fox News, arguing that he enjoys absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for his official acts. The case is to be argued before the justices on April 25th. And, of course, if the court does grant him absolute immunity, then the whole thing, I believe, falls apart. But what say you?
Yes, I think the whole thing then falls apart. And the Supreme Court should grant Trump a victory on that. And it's not just because it's Trump filing it, but because, look, if they don't give immunity to presidents for their official acts while they're president, presidents are going to be afraid to ask. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. Once they leave office, they could be criminally prosecuted for things like, for example, ordering a drone strike on terrorists. The drone strike goes astray. It kills civilians. And a subsequent administration could say, you know what? I don't think that drone strike was justified. I am instructing the Justice Department to criminally prosecute the ex-president for murder for doing that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that could happen.
Is there a way, because I know that if I remember correctly, one of the big arguments was that for Jack Smith, this whole thing, it was written very broadly. Is there a way that if the Supreme Court grants Donald Trump immunity because of what you just said, there's a lot of other implications here regarding future presidents. Is there a way that he could sort of refile or relitigate and have this whole thing be a little more targeted towards just Donald Trump? Is there a way for them to try to, come back at him a second time?
Yeah, because the question that the Supreme Court asked the parties to answer was, does a president have immunity for official acts while he's president? So what Jack Smith, I think, could try to do is come back and say, well, when he was interfering in the election, for example, he wasn't engaged in an official act. But then you get into this really tough determination of, well, how do you figure out whether a presidential act is official or personal? Presidents have almost no personal lives when they're president, and that would just be a really hard line to draw between the two. But that would be the only way Jack Smith could then try to keep pursuing Donald Trump.
Hans von Spakovsky joining us from the Heritage Foundation, our legal analyst. So Fani Willis, and I covered this extensively earlier this week, so I don't have to go through all of the details, but Fani Willis now being allowed to stay on as the DA against Donald Trump in Fulton County. She got caught lying about any number of things. I mean, people say she perjured herself. And the judge said, as you know, that she can stay on as long as her boyfriend, who she clearly hired after they had started dating, I mean, all the evidence points to that, was fired. Well, Hans, I guess what I'm confused about is if the judge said that Fani Willis had to either fire Nathan Wade or he had to step aside, whatever, isn't the judge admitting that there was corruption? And Fani Willis was the one that implemented or facilitated all that corruption. I'm confused.
Well, yeah, look, and on the one hand, the judge did a pretty good job in his order of summarizing the evidence of it, but then I do think he stopped short of what he should have done. I mean, look, when he used terms in his order to describe Fani Willis as unprofessional, to basically question the credibility of the testimony that Nathan Wade was giving, in other words, calling him a liar,
Yep.
And saying that there was an odor of mendacity. I've never seen a term like that. In the whole relationship and the way they reacted to it, their testimony in court, I think he stopped short of doing what he should have done, which is to say that neither of them can be in the case. The defendants, I don't know if you've seen this, but the defendants just filed a motion with this judge asking his permission for an immediate appeal. Because this wasn't a final order by the judge, they have to get the judge's permission to go to the next court up. And I hope the judge gives them the right to immediately appeal, because I think they have substantial grounds for an appeals court to go even further than this judge did.
Well, Hans, you and I have spoken about this before, but the fact that they're going after Trump with these racketeering charges, I think there's a fear within the DA's office that if Fani Willis is out and that entire office I perhaps is deemed corrupt, I don't know, but a new prosecutor may come in and look at the way that they've laid out their case and just say that the whole thing is a mess and it falls apart and, Trump is, justifiably walks free.
Oh, look, I think that is a real possibility. If they go to a good county, one where they actually have a real DA, unlike Fani Willis, who's interested in objective justice and not partisan politics, I think that's exactly what would happen.
Last one here, Hans. Donald Trump, of course, this has been in the news last couple of days, trying to find the bond money so that he can actually
Right.
appeal the New York case where he was accused of inflating the value of his property. Letitia James is out there, of course, saying, and she's been saying this for a long time, that she will take his properties. I guess he has till Monday to find, is it $450 million?
Yeah, and it keeps going up because of interest.
So what can Donald Trump do? I mean, he doesn't have the cash, and people who have money, they have cash, and then they have assets like properties and funds and all these other kinds of things. You can't just come up. I don't care how rich you are. You can't just simply come up with $450 million like that.
Yeah, he's really been put into a fundamentally unfair position because they're saying that unless he does that, he can't appeal.
Yep.
And I think the judgment against him was so filled with bias, mistakes, and errors that it's fundamentally unfair to not allow him to appeal. But, without putting up the property that he owns and the whole, he can't appeal a case. Look, this really shows the whole point of this by Letitia James is to strip him of his wealth because, they failed in getting him off the ballot. And now they think, well, if we can get rid of all of his money, then he can't run an effective campaign for president. I tell you, that's what's really behind this.
And I guess my question is, okay, so let's say that he is able to, fire sale some of his properties. Let's just say he's able to find the $450 million and he's able to appeal this. In 1 minute or less, where would that go for an appeal, and what would the chances be that they would overturn Fani Willis and Judge Engoron?
Well, this is in state court, so I think that it's pretty clear that he's going to have difficulties in the state courts. The state courts of New York are filled with partisan judges, but ultimately, if the highest state court denied his appeal, I actually think he would have grounds to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court because I think the statute under which he was prosecuted was so vague, so broad as to raise very serious constitutional problems over its lack of due process for defendants.
All right, Hans, thank you. Just fascinating indeed.